Hello and welcome to Eye of Gnosis Tarot. My name is Ewan and today we are looking at the last card of the Major Arcana in the suit of swords known as the Ten of Swords. That is before we go on to the court cards of this suit. Now if you haven't already, I highly recommend going back and looking at the playlist for the suit of swords to give much greater context to this card, and of course looking at the playlist I've made for the suit of wands and the suit of cups will give even greater context to this suit and this particular card, the Ten of Swords, as I go into a lot of detail as to what the number 10 means in the tarot within the Ten of Wands and the Ten of Cups. Now, if you just want to look at the Divinatory Interpretations of this card, I have put a timestamp below in the description. However, I recommend looking through the entire video at least once to gain much greater understanding as to why the card has those divinatory interpretations. So without further ado, we shall look at the Ten of Swords, also known as Ruin. So we see here in the Ten of Swords, it has indeed 10 swords featured. However, it's sometimes difficult to see them all, as we may have some obvious ones here, 7 obvious ones, but there's also an 8th one here, a 9th one there, and then the 10th one is very, very hard to see, as we can only see its hilt, and its actual blade is shattered in the centre. So we see the hilts of each of these swords have a different image upon them. And they are arranged in the structure of the Tree of Life in Kabbalah, which is what the tarot is based off. So if we look very carefully, we see here at the top, where Kether should be, we see a pair of weighing scales on the hilt. When we look at Binah and Chokmah, we can see that we have what appear to be a pair of compasses and potentially an hourglass within them. We see here, when we look at Chesed and Geburah, we have the cross on the hilt. In Tippereth, we have the heart and the shattered sword. In Hod and Netzach, we have these 5 pointed stars. And in Yesod, we see this crab upon the hilt. And finally, we see the moon and what might be a pentagram on what is Malkuth, which is the Sephiro which the tens belong to. And at the top, amongst all these hues of orange and red and yellow, we see the sigil of the sun, and at the bottom we see the sigil of Gemini, almost making up the handle of this bottom sword. And we must also note that pinwheels have come back, but they are very chaotic and seem to be almost like raging out of the card, as opposed to falling as they were in the last card, the Nine of Swords. Try and put my wand down there. So, the conclusion of thought has become manifest in the Sephiro of Malkuth now. We have now been wounded by 1,000 cuts from the rusted blades of Yesod, and we were the one wielding the swords after all. Now death is upon us, and it is written in our blood. Malkuth is the collection of all previous Sephiro. It is the well into which all concepts and dimensions flow and gather. Welcome to our universe, as we saw in the Ten of Wands. In the mind, this is expressed as seeing the innate suffering within Malkuth and giving in to despair because of it. Consciousness, emotion, and thought all feel trapped within this matrix of the Demiurge. And if you don't know who the Demiurge is, I recommend going back and looking at the 5 and 6 of Wands. And little do we know that the mind that facilitates these thoughts is the very one who created this prison. In the Gnostic beliefs of the Cathars, this was seen as a very literal reality, and they were quite anxious to leave this world in the hope of an early ascension to heaven. However, just as it was in the Ten of Wands, this is a misunderstanding of the prison that we find ourselves in. Whilst matter is limited and cages energy, we must remember that it is made up of that same energy, and thus cages itself, so that it may become manifest. The same applies here with regard to the realm of thoughts. Being expansive and infinite in nature, thoughts reel at the restrictions of the physical world. This is why our minds philosophize, dream, invent, and fantasize. We do anything to exercise the airy quality of our thoughts in a universe seemingly under the grip of gravity and time. However, as we saw in the 8 and 9 of Swords, this attempt of the mind to expand further and break its limitations only imposes further limitations upon itself. Being the ephemeral things that they are, thoughts cannot quite manifest in the same permanent quality as energy, and thus matter. In its desperate dream for immortality, the mind perceives everything as a trap or a prison, while simultaneously creating a very real prison for itself by conceiving the impossible. For the mind, death is an end, suffering is a limitation, and pain is a terrifying reminder of both. Yet this is a limited and subjective point of view, and thus the true limitation is revealed: the mind itself. The mind can only perceive the world via the senses, both internal and external. Furthermore, it can only interact with these senses via the grace of consciousness, which is energy. In its proud and narrow focus on immortality and selfhood, the mind forgets this fact, and thus it soon becomes frustrated, caught in a delusion of superiority. It does this to quell the nagging insecurity that it is, in fact, not in control and cannot perceive everything. Here we see the logic of the anti-theist, who only believes in that which they can measure. However, the mind is measurement, and in this sense, such beliefs are just that, beliefs. Such a mind becomes an incessant narcissist, living in an echo chamber of its own making, unwilling to surrender to the notion that it may not know everything, and that there are things that thought alone cannot perceive. So after that mic drop, we're going to look at the symbolism and divinatory interpretations of the card, but first the symbolism. So we see the 10 swords I spoke about at the first here arranged in the pattern of the Tree of Life. And the 10 swords represent a violent and terrible ending for the mind here. This is not the natural end of that we see in Atu 13, the Death card, but something forced and premature. A murder conducted by thought, so to speak. Here in Malkuth, thoughts have thoroughly run their course and have literally caused us to hit rock bottom. There is nothing for it anymore, and we must cut the threads binding us if we are ever to be free. Yet even here a choice can be made between the twins of Gemini. Here their dual nature is exaggerated by the presence of the sun, and one at the height of the summer solstice at that, for this card rules the last decan of Gemini, just as the 10 of Wands ruled the last decan of Sagittarius. And that card, the 10 of Wands, is known as oppression. In this sense, the discerning twin cuts the threads of karma and self-imposed illusion with a single thought of clarity, which is, of course, the Ace of Swords, as represented here at the top in Kether. And this is akin to the rising of the sun on the longest day. Meanwhile, the despairing twin cuts the thread of life with 1,000 rusted blades, just as the setting sun ushers in the decline of the year. Thus, the dual aspect of the Ten of Swords is revealed. It is either the ruin of our ruin, and hence our salvation, or it is the ruin of ourselves, and hence our damnation. Now, the swords here are arranged in the pattern of the Tree of Life, as said, and the first sword we see here under the sun symbolises Kether. It has the scales of Libra upon its hilt, because Saturn is exalted in Libra, and here represents the inherent link between mind, ego, and time. It is also the highest planet amidst the air signs' exalted placements, and in Kether we see time, mind, and ego, which are all the same thing, have become balanced and thus suspended. So the ego is suspended when Saturn is in Libra, and when the ego is suspended, we realise our self, our true self, the one, the whole, Kether. The next set of swords we see here represent Chokmah and Binah, and they sport hourglasses topped with a pair of compasses. These represent the flow of that time, which is also the mind and the ego, and also represents its cyclical nature that creates boundaries for itself. We can see this as the rim of the circle, the Ouroboros, the circle being the whole and the rim trying to make it a thing. Chokmah and Binah complete the supernal triad of consciousness that we talked about in the 1, 2, and 3 of Wands, well, the Ace of Wands, should I say, when I say 1, and thus allow for the circle of time to be drawn around this Holy Trinity. In other words, we can't conceive a circle without the conception of a triangle when we are looking at points of reference. The swords of Geburah and Chesed have ornamental crosses on their hilts, and these represent the structure of time and the mind and the ego, and the structure that it gives and is given by the manifest universe. We can see that they have inherently Christian undertones towards the orthodoxy of the demiurge. That is the little god, the ego, the god that thinks it is God, and the organisation of its reality from here on, that being the duality of order and consciousness as represented by these two Sephirah. We see the central sword here is the sword of Tippereth, and of course it has the heart on the hilt, for it is the heart of the Tree of Life and is also analogous to the heart chakra in Vedic traditions. It is also symbolic of Christ consciousness, which is also known as Buddha nature. And the sword is broken as it has been put under too much pressure by the other elements of the mind. And they have pressed down so hard upon it that the heart and thus love can no longer expand. And the heart needs to expand, it needs nurturing, not ruling. Thus it has become tortured and subdued. The 10 white rays of light that we see emanating from the heart, and it's quite hard to see in this light, but we can just about make them out. They look more yellow in this video. But if you have a card of your own, if you look, they're slightly more white. These represent the compassion that the heart still has for its deluded protector, the ego, which has now become its jailer and torturer in the illusion of the material realm. Here we see another very direct reference to the concept of Christ consciousness, the idea of Christ sacrificing himself for our sins. To put this into a greater context, our heart sacrificing itself for the mind. The next set of swords we see belong to Netzarch and Hod. On their hilts we see a 4-pointed star. This symbolises direction and navigation, telling us that time, mind, ego has become fully immersed in its own confined reality and believes it has agency and choice. However, the truth is more apparent in the supernal triad, whereby it is really nothing but a guardian of consciousness, and the ego is forever doomed to eat its own tail in its own desperate attempt to control reality. And we see here the sword of Yesod has the crab upon it, and this is representative of the sign of Cancer, and this is because Cancer is ruled by the moon, and the moon rules the Sephiroth of Yesod. And we see that Saturn, time, so the ego, the demiurge, it is in its detriment in Cancer, and restricts this otherwise nurturing and sensitive sign. Think of the contrast between a warm, caring mother and a cold, restrictive father. Thus, the endless potential of Yesod has also been restricted, and it has become nothing but a mirror for unnecessary thoughts, and we saw that in the 9 of Swords, known as cruelty. And finally, at the bottom here, we see the sword representing Malkuth, which has a crescent moon on its hilt, and is shorn near the guard so that the blade is barely visible, and in a way, and I suppose we could say that it is somewhat got the sigil of Gemini as its hilt. This sword represents the completeness of the card, reflecting the sigil of the sun above, so the moon is reflecting the sun. It also emphasises the symbolism in Yesod, yet there is even more illusion here. In fact, it's not illusion, it's become delusion in this sense, and we see this repeated in the Atu 18, which is the moon card. And of course, we can see that the twins do reflect each other, hence the moon. Now, we're going to look at the Divinatory Interpretations of this card, after that very long description. In divination, the 10 of Swords represents sudden and violent endings. When well dignified, the card represents revelation, salvation, rebirth, painful lessons, and reaching such a point of destruction that we are forced to destroy that which is destroying us. When ill-dignified, the card represents despair, death, suicide, painful endings, unbearable anguish, loss, and catastrophe. I don't know why I was having trouble saying that. The key concept, however, here is an end from which there is no going back from, whether that be for our betterment or for our worse. So that has been the 10 of Swords, concludes the 10 cards of the Minor Arcana in the Suit of Swords. Next time we will be looking at the court cards of the Suit of Swords, and for one particular card I need to find a way to edit the image, because now YouTube won't let me show it. And until then, if you liked what you saw here today and found the information useful or interesting, please do hit that like button. It really does help the channel. And feel free to share this video with other people who are interested in tarot, esotericism, Thelema, and the Thoth deck, and of course astrology as well. And if you'd like to see more videos about the Thoth deck and tarot, as well as tarot readings that I do every now and then, although they become less frequent due to my job, please do hit the bell icon and the subscribe button so that you don't miss any future videos. So thank you again, everybody, and I hope you have a wonderful day, evening, morning, afternoon, wherever you are in the world, and goodbye.